All right, everybody. Welcome back. This is going to be a unique kind of video today. So instead of being at my computer, I'm going to try out this content of me walking around. I'm walking around campus right now, so you might see some birds or some flowers or something. Maybe some crazy people. But, okay. Topic for today's rambling. I'm going to talk about the core intuition behind starting my YouTube channel and the idea behind the ideas that are driving, my fundamental discovery and interactions with reality. Now, I'm not going to use fancy words so I can keep this palatable for people of all audiences. But to put it simply, the beliefs that you hold on to should be there to serve you, rather than you holding on to beliefs to serve them. Now I'm going to put that in some more simpler terms. The beliefs that you hold on to should serve you, and it shouldn't be the other way around. You shouldn't be serving your beliefs. Beliefs should be tools that you use to accomplish turning intent into reality. And when you let a bunch of beliefs clog up your mind that don't serve a purpose that you intentionally want to serve, that's where we get into things with propaganda, subliminal messaging, hypnotism, kind of these subconscious override techniques that are baked into a lot of the aspects of our culture and reality. For example, look at memes. Look at that. I see a 6'7". I'm going to flip. Look at that. Six, 7. Okay. Memes. The entire idea of word viruses, neurolinguistic programs, they're baked into the neurological structure of your mind. Now, not to get too off into the woods about word viruses and memetics, but anything that affects the way that you perceive reality, even if it's in a really basic way, like a meme, something you laugh at, something that evokes an energetic response out of you, it's wrapped up in this kind of ideological substrata that is what we call belief. So, you want to make sure that the beliefs that you hold and that you act on serve you. Another example of holding on to beliefs that do not serve you, it's like letting guests in at your dining table and you don't know who they are. A lot of people kind of just stumble into their religion or into their ideological configuration through genetic heritage. So I listened to this other professor. He's English. His name is, he's got a YouTube channel called The Jolly Heretic. But Professor Edward Dutton, he wrote a book about how to judge people by the way they look. Actually, that was another book, but he wrote about that. But basically, a lot of his content covers the genetic aspect of, belief and ideology. And what I've come to understand and see is that it's spot on. Religion is 0.8 hereditary, and same thing with like ideological affiliation. It's something very more than what you would expect from random chance to be heritable. And so in simple terms, what that means is that if your parents are, Republican, then you'll be Republican. If your parents are Baptist or Mormon, you're going to be more likely to be Mormon or Baptist or whatever they are. So, with that in mind, the important thing to take away from this is that you don't have to have that kind of baked in ideological or religio whatever kind of dogma system, you can choose who sits at your table. It doesn't have to be, whatever your genetics or whatever your timeline was born into. God gave man free will, and I'm going to use that as a vehicle to kind of elaborate on this point. Free will is the ability to choose who's sitting at your wedding table. If you're getting married, you don't want to invite a whole bunch of strangers, unless you do, but at least it was a conscious choice. It's such a nice day outside. So, I think I've elaborated on the point of what I'm trying to say with that you should choose your beliefs, and you should choose them not just because you were born into them. I like to use an example here. It's pretty obvious that history is written by the victors, but what that actually means is that, take it from this perspective. Isn't it crazy that throughout all of recorded human history, only the good guys have ever won? Isn't that kind of interesting and unique? What are the odds that, in this reality, that it was always the good guys who just managed to win all throughout human history? Isn't that crazy how America's always been the good guys? Anyway, same thing for your religion. Isn't it crazy that, what are the astronomical odds that you, out of all of the, people that were born and will be born, that you were born in the right time, the right religion, the right race, the right geopolitical identity? What are the odds that you got them all right on your first try? Isn't that crazy? I bet you guys have never even heard of Zoroastrianism. A lot of you probably haven't. But I bet the Zoroastrians thought that they were pretty spot on with their cosmology and their entire role and identity. The Mesopotamians with their cuneiform. That's one of the things that a lot of Christianity doesn't address. A lot of these kind of new sprung up denominations don't address the fact that people existed before Christ and what happens to them. And so that's kind of a big problem in that's why we have so many denominations in Christianity. And that's why Eastern Orthodoxy with the Pope and the papal authority. Anyway, you can throw a stone, it's a glass house everywhere you go with ideologies. And this is getting at the meta point. All the infighting, all of the denominatory kind of ideological battles, they all stem from this idea that the beliefs in these belief systems, we'll call them belief systems, you can call them whatever they are, but another word for that is egregores. Egregores are kind of a life, kind of a god that's taken on a form of a belief system. But, these belief systems are constructed very precisely, very carefully to serve an intelligent purpose here. Why? And proof for this is religions are all about controlling reproduction. Pretty much, this is kind of a side tangent, maybe I'll make a video on that later, but if you look at pretty much all of the religious dogma and religious doctrine, a lot of the granularities and differences and specifications just come down to how and what is morally okay to do with the process of reproduction. And that gets at a more kind of esoteric and philosophical, metaphysical kind of perspective about what is generation and what is like creation, what is the entire metaphysical principle of creating a life, and what is consciousness. Those are all questions that you got to bake into that kind of idea of controlling reproduction. But to bring this back in here, you want to make sure that the belief configuration, the belief system that you set up and that you commit to in this time here that you have, and that God or whatever the universe, nature, reality has given you. You could even go in the complete materialistic sense of just pure causality has given you this principle of chaos and uncertainty, where you at least believe you have the illusion of freedom of choice. But I also would like to point to any materialists who have that idea that it's very difficult to hold a pure materialist stance when you really dig into the first mover problem. So that is, the Big Bang. How can you have something from nothing? As well as Gödel's incompleteness theorem. So the fact that any structured system of logic is built on a set of foundational axioms that you can't actually prove without having just assumed them to be true. Side tangent on Gödel's incompleteness theorem. We'll go over that too. But wrapping this back up nicely, I've noticed a lot of people don't question the friends that they let sit at their wedding table. They don't question the authority that they hold over their future. Here's one example while I'm just walking here. When I crack, you break your mother's back, okay? How would that belief change the way that I behave? If not consciously, if I just think that's a little nursery rhyme, a fairy tale. My unconscious or subconscious can't differentiate between what I think is just superstition or what is actually reality. You could convince a paranoid schizophrenic, and that's why we call people paranoid schizophrenics, because they hold on to these beliefs and they can't discriminate between what general consensus reality is and what isn't. So, for some mentally sound person, they wouldn't really consider stepping on a crack to be a grave evil. But imagine a world or a society or a belief system that became the general consensus where, if you step on a crack, you could be thrown in jail. That's how kind of arbitrary a lot of these belief systems can be. And, you'd see massive social upheaval. They'd remove all the cracks in the road. They would remove everything to prevent people from breaking this kind of social taboo of not stepping on cracks, assuming that we're in that kind of world where that ideology, that's baked into their ideology of general consensus reality. I'll give a little side tangent here about what I mean by general consensus reality. Dr. Timothy Leary has an 8-circuit model of the brain. Timothy Leary did a lot of research on LSD, and the government threw him in jail back in the 60s. But what did come out of that research into psychotropics and psychedelics is that general consensus reality and what we collectively agree on, generally speaking, is what it's what we call reality. But for somebody who's tripping out in acid right now, that sunset over there could be like a nuclear holocaust happening. They could see demons fighting and angels in the sky. They could see all sorts of crazy stuff. And the day that those crazy schizophrenics outnumber the people who quote unquote have a sound or sane reality tunnel, the day that that flips over, that's where you get things like the Salem witch trials, things like the big Red Scare, what was that, with McCarthyism, things where they just try to find communists and throw them in jail, the Japanese internment camps during World War II, things like that, thinking people are spying. The second that general consensus reality shifts from what yours is the second things get a little haywire. And so that's what I mean with general consensus reality. It's that most people would look at that sunset and say, yeah, that's a pretty nice sunset. Buddhism and Eastern philosophy takes this kind of idea to the extremes, where it's like first there's a mountain, then there isn't, then there's a valley, and then there isn't, and then there's a mountain again. And that's basically just highlighting the fact that when you go up a hill, it looks like there's a hill. But when you're at the top of a hill, it's a valley. And so who's to say that the hill that you're on is a hill and the valley that's there is a valley? You can only judge it from the perspective of somebody who can see up or down. To somebody who's at the top of that hill, it's just a flat surface. And, that's kind of how... I don't know much about the flat earth people, but I feel like a lot of them are controlled opposition. Like the CIA infiltrating these groups and saying just the absolute most ridiculous kind of ideas possible to discredit some of the core intuitions that flat earthers do have about the firmament and about how the stars are set in the sky and about astrological measurements and things like that. A lot of flat earthers have very intelligent things to say, but they're drowned out by the massive influx of people who, and actually maybe not even people, maybe three-letter agencies who happen to spread what's called controlled opposition. Maybe that might be an interesting topic to make a little deep dive into. But I'm getting off on a tangent here about consensus reality. Anyway, so point of this video is to maybe open people's eyes a little bit because, meditation. Why is meditation important? Well, meditation is a vehicle for you to get better at choosing what beliefs are sitting at your table. It's a vehicle for you to increase your capacity, your willpower, your know-how in the realm of mental planes. To put that in simple terms, meditation lets you choose the beliefs that are best for you at your current state and time, at your current space-time continuum, your 3D position plus 1.5 or whatever dimension for temporality. Meditation lets you step out of 3D space, step out of 1 or whatever 2D time. It lets you step out of all of those illusions that we experience in our general consensus reality. Meditation lets you collapse all of the universe into a single breath. Meditation lets you collapse all of the past and the present and the future into one single breath. And the power of just sitting still and contemplating on that, the power that's held within breathing, everything in the world breathes. Everything in creation breathes. People like to think that the Big Bang and the big crunch happens, so the universe expands, it gets to a stable point, then it contracts, and then it does it again and again in cycles. That's what, that's how the Hindus and their kalpas, a kalpa is like an aeon, it's a measurement of time in that philosophy. They had this stuff figured out a long time ago, actually before time, That's what I like to reference if you're a Christian, if that's your flavor. Ecclesiastes, meaningless. King Solomon, the first verse, meaningless. Everything under the sun has been done before, or something like that. What point is there in doing something that's already been done? I do like the end of Ecclesiastes, or at least the point that Solomon was trying to make. That was actually my graduation quote. It was Ecclesiastes, I think 7 or something, but it's better to have one hand in tranquility than two hands in toil and chasing after the wind. Which is, I saw a clip that said the point of reality is to have fun, Well, I'd say the point of this existence is to experience a life in the Earth life system. I think that's pretty darn close to it. But whatever that means, that's at least what I've seen so far with meditation. But to wrap this back around, I'm wrangling cats here with these ideas, Meditation will get you better at wrangling those kinds of cats. You know, I like to ask people, how do you catch a horse? It's a kind of a Buddhist thing, Zen Buddhist koan. A koan is a paradox teaching. But, you know, you ask people, how do you catch a horse? You can't chase after it because it'll outrun you. You can't lasso it. I mean, you might be able to, but that's not the point of the message. The idea is that the way you catch a horse is with a sugar cube. You let it come to you. Okay? Meditation is catching the horse that is your mind, your untamed mind, the pure chaos principle. If you're a pure materialist, you could say the fluctuations on the Bose-Einstein condensate, whatever, the Higgs field, you know, that kind of principle of creation and destruction, annihilation of protons, blah, 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 and anti-protons. You can call it whatever you want, but that randomness that's associated with life, that's where things break down. Look at this. People are happy. You can see life when you open your eyes. All sorts of life. You got people having a kind of a banquet up there. Look at that. Looks like they're having fun. You got people watching the sunset. I'm not going to creep on them. But, you know, meditation will help you realize that you're just one measurer in this big field of things to be measured. I'll give you a little piece of wisdom here, a little nugget for making it this far into the video. The only way you can lose life is by taking it seriously. Because, you know, I like to say, we're all dogs trapped in God's hot car. All right? I don't know if anybody can consciously remember before they were born and what they did to choose to be here. But it's kind of like you just wake up one day and you have an identity and you have a life. And there's no real reason for why. It just is. So once you realize that everybody else is playing that game too, some of them may or may not also have woken up to that realization. Some people are really good at staying in character and staying in their roles. There's a very famous Buddhist, I don't know if it's very famous, but there's a famous Buddhist teaching where the idea is that to further it or help you gain enlightenment, you should treat everybody else as if they're already a fully enlightened Buddha. And they're just pretending to be whatever role they are. Because that's the entire principle of Eastern tradition, is what is called Wu Wei, or the art of doing nothing. And when we as a Westerner say doing nothing, we think of a lack of productivity. But in the true abstract sense of what Wu Wei is, I'll do a video on this as well, but Wu Wei is the art of doing nothing, and then put in parentheses here, outside of your nature or outside of the allotment that God has given you. And that's exactly the same thing that Solomon was saying with better to have one hand in tranquility than two in toil and chasing the wind. You know, if God made you to be really good at one task, or to be, you know, in your position where you're doing what you're doing, take pleasure in that. And do nothing in deficiency and do nothing in excess. Do it exactly the way that it is made to be done. And that doesn't have to be boring. That's actually the most exciting thing, is finding the balance between excess and deficiency. Because that is where the true skill of virtue comes in, of Wu Wei. Do only that which only you can do. Because if you start trying to do things that, you know, God made Steve or Joe or Smith, when you start trying to do things that God made them to do, you know, how silly are you going to look when you're gathering up nuts for the winter and you're not a squirrel? God made people to have, you know, I guess houses or something, or shelter, be able to use our brains to make that, you know. You know, how crazy would it be if you see people hibernating in the winter trying to kick bears out of their cave? You know, it's kind of silly. So only do the things that only you can do. That's a pretty good teaching. I'm getting off on a little bit of a rant tangent here, but we'll rein this back in. Meditation lets you uncover exactly what God made you to do. And if God is the word that turns you off, I just use that to wrap in the principle of causality, nature, whatever this is, you know, whatever it is that's forcing you to sit here and watch me, whoever's behind that screen, that's what I'm talking about. So, it doesn't have to be anything crazy. Anyway, so to wrap this back in, the beliefs that you have in your mind, they don't have to be the ones that were put there by somebody else. They can be ones that you selectively curate. And they can be beliefs that are effective for you in your reality, in what you want to do, and what you were made to do. You know, I read a book, I think it's by Matthew Kelly. It's called The Three Ordinary Voices of God. And it's very Christian flavored, but God speaks to you through your wants, through your desires, and through your needs. I think that's how it was put. But the core teaching in that is that God made these impulses and desires and things in you to be harvested and cultivated in exactly that kind of Chinese philosophy sense of Wu Wei, not in any deficiency. A deficiency in virtue, let's take courage for example. A deficiency in courage is that kind of weakness and frailty, cowardice. But an excess in courage is kind of aggression or wrath. So riding that line between the two extremes is the game. You know, that's the fun part. That's where you get to mess up and make mistakes. And that's why God is always forgiving, you know. That's the big point of Christianity, is that the prodigal son, you know, no matter how far you go, there's always redemption as long as you come back and wake up. I'll do some more deep dives into religious or Christian stories and different parables if that's something that's interesting. But the point of this video was that you don't have to stay. And here's one thing where people go wrong. If you are kind of having a sudden realization where, oh man, I'm a real person, I can choose to live my life, I can become whatever I want to be, I can manifest, bro. Manifestation is a very subtle art of putting in a lot of work and putting in a lot of intelligent work, not just sitting there with crystals in your room and, you know, but not to offend any of my spiritual Wiccan girlies. I love rocks, like Malphite in League of Legends, rock solid. But yeah, meditation is that tool in your toolkit to straddle those means, or straddle those extremes to get to the mean. That's kind of what I've learned from my 1,000 days of doing Hemi-Sync. Now, Hemi-Sync is a protocol. Hemi-Sync is a protocol. It's not the only way to achieve enlightenment. There's plenty of ways to lighten your load here on this Earth life system. You know, the Hindus, the Bhagavad Gita, people read. Some people can read and attain, you know, get closer to God through reading. But that's why I've read a lot of books, is because there's a lot of good wisdom in books. But the Bhagavad Gita says that the only action that isn't wasted is meaningless or purposeless action. It's an English translation thing, but the idea is that any action that you take in the world for the purpose of bearing fruit in the world, that is the fruit of that action. And the world that you derive the fruit in is the same that consumes it. This teaching is trying to say that it's the same thing with like Satanism. When you do everything in the world and you do these rituals and whatever, and you configure reality to, you know, worship the sun or Saturn and you get exactly what you want, it'll also get consumed in the same manner that it's created. So the teaching is that the only not wasted action is meditation on God, or meditation on, there's Purusha and Prakti, there's the field and the viewer of the field, and the only not wasted action is meditation on that kind of thing. Because this is where the whole story of Bhagavad Gita is, where the Hindu god Krishna comes down to Arjuna. He's about to go fight, and they have these brothers fighting brothers, family fighting family, and he's like, well, man, what am I going to do? I can't do this because I've seen both sides of it. I don't want to take a side. And Krishna says, well, you know what? You're a dog trapped in a hot car with everybody else here. So I'm summarizing a little bit, but he says, go forth and conquer. If you win, you attain the fruits of the world, right? If you win the battle, obviously you get the spoils. And he says, well, and if you die in battle, you attain heaven because you were doing exactly what you were made to do. That's a very terse summary of Arjuna encountering Krishna. But
wait.
Oh, there we go. Look at that. Ask and you shall receive. I push the button, I get to cross. Yeah. Making sure I don't get hit by a car. But if that's my lot in life, so be it. And that's I'll tie this into another Christian teaching. This is with Abraham sacrificing Isaac on the altar. God didn't want him to do it, or to follow through with it, right? But it's that willingness to walk across a street, with your eyes closed. Maybe not with your eyes closed, but it's the willingness to take that leap. And when you do take that leap, you'll find very quickly that God lets you know whether you're doing the right direction or not very quickly. We're coming up on time here. I made a little lap around campus. So, to summarize the main points here, the number one idea is that make sure that the beliefs that you let, the friends that you let come to your house, make sure that they're good, and they're the ones that, at least the ones that you chose. We can get into the Aristotelian dialectic of good or evil, and whatever that means. But make sure it's at least the beliefs that you curated. Make it sure that it's at least something that is cultivated and derived in a way that's meaningful for your unique, specific individuation of life. Number two, if you have no idea what I'm talking about and you want to get better at curating beliefs, meditation is a good vehicle for that. Hemi-Sync is what I'm putting together with these resources. You'll find them somewhere. I'll put them in the channel. But I'm putting together basically a journaling app, a template using Obsidian, and a link to all those Hemi-Sync files. And I hope to make a guide to help people work through that. Because even just trying it once will save you a lot of time when you try to tackle the idea of consciousness. So, number one, make sure that the beliefs that you hold on to are the ones that you want to hold on to. And number two, you can use meditation to get better at that process of selecting those beliefs. That's about all I got for today. Man, the moon is so bright. Look at that. It's a bright moon, full moon. Let me know what you guys think in the comments if you like this kind of content and want to see more. See ya.